February 14th, 1946. Exactly 1 year after the firestorm, a woman stands in what used to be her street. She cannot find her house. Not because it was destroyed, everything was destroyed, but because the entire geography of her world has been erased. Where there were buildings, there are mountains of rubble. Where there were streets, there are paths carved through debris by human hands. Where there were 630,000 people, there are ghosts. The war was over. The misery wasn't. This is Dresden, 1946, the year the world forgot. To understand Dresden in 1946, you must first understand what Dresden lost in 1945. On the night of February 13th, the Baroque jewel of Germany, a city that had escaped much of the war's devastation, became the target of one of the most controversial bombing campaigns in military history. In less than 15 hours, British and American bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The resulting firestorm consumed 15 square miles of the city center. Temperatures reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire created its own weather system, generating winds of over 100 miles per hour that sucked people into the flames like leaves into a vortex. The exact death toll remains debated. Conservative estimates suggest 25,000 dead. Some claimed over 100,000. What isn't debated is this: Dresden ceased to exist as a functioning city. But the bombing, as catastrophic as it was only the beginning of Dresden's suffering. Because when the bombers left and the fires burned out, Dresden faced something arguably worse than the raid itself: survival without infrastructure, food, or hope. And they would face it under Soviet occupation as the Iron Curtain began to fall across Europe. When the war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, Dresden was still burning. Not with flames. Those had been extinguished weeks earlier by Soviet soldiers and German civilians working side by side in a grotesque preview of occupation. No, Dresden burned with a different kind of fire: the slow cremation of a city's corpses.
The dead were everywhere, buried in collapsed cellars where families had sought shelter from the firestorm, fused together in bomb shelters where the heat had melted human flesh into unrecognizable masses, scattered in pieces across the Altmarkt, the old market square that became an open-air crematorium where Soviet authorities burned bodies on massive pyres for weeks. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish philologist who survived both the Nazis and the firestorm, wrote in his diary, "The horror is beyond words. Not the flames themselves, those I can describe, but the smell, the sweet, sick smell of roasted meat that hung over the city for months. That smell was people. That smell was Dresden." By January 1946, most of the identifiable bodies had been buried or burned, but Dresden still gave up its dead. Construction workers clearing rubble would break through a basement wall and find mummified families preserved by the intense heat. Children playing in ruins would uncover human bones. Death was not past tense in Dresden. It was present, everywhere, always. But Dresden in 1946 wasn't just a city of the dead. Somehow, impossibly, it was also a city of the living. Over 400,000 people inhabited the ruins. They called themselves Trümmermenschen, rubble people, but a better name might have been cave people, because in the absence of standing buildings, Dresdeners lived underground. They carved homes from the cellars of destroyed buildings, creating a vast network of subterranean dwellings beneath the rubble mountains. These weren't temporary shelters. These were elaborate living spaces. Families hung blankets to create rooms. They scavenged bricks to build walls. They installed makeshift chimneys that poked through the debris like periscopes from a buried city. From above, Dresden looked abandoned. From below, it teemed with desperate life. Water came from a handful of functioning wells, often contaminated. Electricity existed only in Soviet administrative buildings. Heat came from burning whatever could burn: furniture, books, wooden beams pulled from ruins. When those ran out, people burned their ration cards cardboard.
Margaret Freyer, a survivor, described her cellar home. "We had 4 walls made from broken brick, a ceiling of corrugated metal held up by charred wood beams. No windows. Why would we need windows? There was nothing to see. We lived by candlelight, even at noon. We were moles. We were worms. We were anything but human." The irony was crushing. After years of hiding in cellars from Allied bombs, Dresdeners were still living in cellars a year after the war ended. The bombs had stopped, but the hiding continued. But if shelter was difficult, food was impossible. The winter of 1945 to 46 became known as the Hunger Winter, the Hunger Winter. Across occupied Germany, it was catastrophic. In Dresden, it was apocalyptic. The official Soviet ration for German civilians was 1,200 calories per day. In reality, Dresdeners received less than 800. For context, that's roughly equivalent to 2 bowls of thin soup and a slice of bread per day, for men, women, and children alike. But even those meager rations rarely materialized. The supply system, if you could call it that, was chaos. Soviet authorities prioritized feeding the Red Army and Communist Party administrators. What remained went to workers deemed essential for reconstruction. Everyone else? They got promises and paper ration cards that could not be redeemed. Starvation became Dresden's new destroyer, slower than the Firestorm, but equally effective. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs haunted the streets, searching through rubble for anything edible. Adults' faces took on a skeletal quality, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and dreamlike. Doctors reported widespread edema, tuberculosis, and diseases associated with severe malnutrition. People ate things human beings should never eat. Wallpaper paste, boiled for its wheat content, grass and leaves cooked into bitter soups, rats when they could catch them. There are even whispered stories, never confirmed, always denied, of worse things that happen when human beings are pushed beyond the boundaries of civilization. The black market became Dresden's real economy. A loaf of bread cost 50 Reichsmarks officially. On the black market, 400. A pound of butter, 1,000 Reichsmarks. People traded family heirlooms for potatoes, wedding rings for lard, dignity for survival. And always, the Soviet soldiers watched.
The Soviet occupation of Dresden was not liberation. It was conquest. To be clear, the Soviet Union had paid an unimaginable price to defeat Nazi Germany. Over 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. The Red Army that entered Dresden had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin through some of the most brutal combat in human history. They had earned their victory through blood. But what Dresdeners experienced in 1946 was not the gratitude of the liberated. It was the wrath of the victorious. Soviet soldiers dismantled Dresden's remaining infrastructure with systematic efficiency. Factories that survived the bombing were stripped of machinery and shipped east as reparations. Railway tracks were torn up and sent to the Soviet Union. Even hospital equipment disappeared overnight. But the most painful occupation came at a more personal level. The mass rapes that followed the Red Army's entry into Eastern Germany are among World War II's most documented yet least discussed atrocities. Conservative estimates suggest 100,000 women in Berlin alone. In Dresden, the numbers remain unknown, but survivor testimonies paint a picture of systematic sexual violence that continued well into 1946. Women and girls lived in constant fear. They disguised themselves as old women, smearing their faces with soot. They hid in the deepest cellars. They moved only in groups. And still the attacks came, in ruins, in occupied apartments, in administrative offices where women went to beg for ration cards. The Soviet authorities were aware. Some commanders tried to stop it. Most looked away.
A few participated. For Dresden's women, the war's end meant trading one kind of terror for another. But here's what makes this history so painfully complex. Individual Soviet soldiers often showed unexpected humanity. They shared their military rations with starving children. They helped clear rubble without being ordered to. They fell in love with German women and tried to protect them from their own comrades. The occupation was not a monolith. It was thousands of individual encounters between traumatized soldiers and traumatized civilians, playing out across a landscape of total devastation. In the absence of men, dead, imprisoned, or still in POW camps, German women rebuilt their nation one brick at a time. They called them the Trümmerfrauen, the Rubble women, and they became the iconic image of post-war Germany's reconstruction. Every morning at dawn, thousands of Dresden women reported to rubble clearing sites. Armed with hammers, chisels, and bare hands, they worked 10-hour shifts dismantling what the bombs had destroyed. They chipped mortar from bricks so the bricks could be reused. They hauled wheelbarrows of debris. They formed human chains, passing rubble hand to hand from collapsed buildings to collection points.
It was back-breaking, dangerous work. Unstable walls collapsed without warning. Hidden munitions exploded. Women fell through floors into flooded basements. Cuts became infected in the unsanitary conditions. Backs gave out. Hands bled. But the work continued. Because for many women, rubble clearing wasn't just reconstruction, it was survival. Workers received extra rations, an additional 400 calories per day. In the hunger winter of 1945 to 46, those 400 calories meant the difference between life and death. More than that, the work provided something Germany's women desperately needed: purpose. Ursula von Kardorf, a journalist who worked in the rubble, wrote, "When you spend your days lifting bricks, you don't spend them remembering what you lost. The physical pain distracts from the emotional pain. The visible progress, a street cleared, a wall restored, gives hope when everything else gives despair. We didn't work to rebuild Germany, we worked to rebuild ourselves." By the end of 1946, Dresden's Trümmerfrauen had cleared over 3 million cubic meters of rubble. They had salvaged millions of bricks. They had created new streets through the ruins, mapped the city's destruction, and just begun, to imagine what might rise from the ashes. They worked without praise, without recognition, without reward, beyond survival. And they saved Dresden. But amid Dresden's ruins lived the war's most invisible victims: children. An estimated 40,000 children under the age of 14 lived in Dresden in 1946. Many were orphans, their parents dead in the firestorm, the war, or from starvation and disease in the chaotic months that followed. Others had been separated from their families in the massive refugee flows as millions fled the advancing Soviet armies. These children grew up in a world without childhood. 5-year-olds scavenged through rubble for anything valuable: metal fragments to trade, unburned wood to sell, coal dropped from Soviet trucks. 7-year-olds cared for younger siblings in cellar homes while their mothers cleared rubble. 10-year-olds worked alongside adults, their small hands perfect for reaching into tight spaces in collapsed buildings. They had no schools. 90% of Dresden's school buildings were destroyed. They had no playgrounds, only ruins filled with unexploded ordnance. They had no toys, only the detritus of war. Child psychologists who arrived with relief organizations in late 1946 described an entire generation with what we'd now call severe PTSD. Children who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who flinched at loud noises, who hoarded food obsessively, who couldn't remember a time before violence.
Some had forgotten how to play. Dr. Anneliese Schmidt, who worked in a Dresden orphanage in 1946, recorded, "We tried to organize games for the children, but they didn't understand the concept of games without winners and losers, without survival stakes. Tag became too aggressive. Pretend play centered entirely on soldiers, bombs, and death. One little girl built a dollhouse from brick fragments, then systematically destroyed it with stones. She called it the bombing game. She was 6 years old. These children would grow up to rebuild East Germany. They would become its engineers, its teachers, its leaders. But they would carry Dresden 1946 in their psyches forever, a ghost city inside their minds, never quite exorcised. While Dresdeners fought for physical survival, a different kind of transformation was underway. Dresden's political rebirth as a Soviet satellite. The Soviet military administration, SMAD, didn't just occupy Dresden, it remade it. By 1946, the communist transformation of Eastern Germany was well underway. The Soviet Union installed German communists, many of whom had spent the war years in Moscow, into positions of authority. They nationalized industries, they collectivized agriculture. They purged anyone suspected of Nazi sympathies or capitalist leanings. In Dresden, this meant a dual reality. On paper, Dresden was being rebuilt as a socialist paradise, a city without class divisions, without fascism, without the evils that had led to war. Soviet propaganda posters plastered across ruins promised bread, work, and equality. The Communist Party organized reconstruction brigades, political education sessions, cultural programs designed to create the new socialist man. In reality, Dresden was a police state in ruins. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, established networks of informers. They arrested thousands on suspicion of anti-Soviet activity, often on the flimsiest evidence. Former Nazi party members faced harsh punishments, imprisonment, forced labor, execution. But the definition of Nazi sympathizer expanded to include anyone who criticized Soviet policies, questioned the official narrative, or simply wanted to leave. The irony was bitter. Dresdeners had been bombed by Western democracy and now lived under Eastern totalitarianism. They had escaped one dictatorship, only to be captured by another. Yet some Dresdeners genuinely believed in the socialist vision. After the horrors of Nazism and war, the promise of equality and peace resonated. Young people especially, those with no memory of pre-war prosperity, joined the communist youth organizations, genuinely convinced they were building something better from the ruins. Dresden in 1946 was becoming two cities, the physical city of Rubble and hunger, and the ideological city of socialist transformation. These two cities would coexist, uneasily, for the next 43 years, until 1989, when the wall fell, and Dresden could finally choose its own future. By December 31, 1946, Dresden had survived its first full year of peace. The death toll from starvation, disease, and cold would never be fully calculated. Thousands had fled west across the emerging border between Soviet and Western occupation zones. Thousands more had disappeared into Soviet prisons. The city's population had swelled with refugees, then contracted as people left or died.
But Dresden endured. The rubble mountains were smaller. Some streets had been cleared. A handful of buildings had been partially restored. The trams, Dresden's beloved streetcars, began running again on limited routes. Life, in some abbreviated form, returned. Yet the city that emerged from 1946 was not the Dresden that had existed before. That Dresden, the Baroque jewel, the Florence on the Elbe, was gone forever. In its place grew something harder, sadder, more resilient. The Frauenkirche, the Church of Our Lady, Dresden's most famous landmark, remained a ruined shell. Its collapsed dome, visible for miles, became the city's signature, a monument not to glory, but to loss. Today, if you visit Dresden, you'll see a city that's been rebuilt twice. First in the socialist realism of East Germany, then again after reunification with careful historical restoration. The Frauenkirche stands again, reconstructed from its original stones between 1994 and 2005. But if you look carefully, you can still see 1946. It's there in the old women who remember being children in the cellars. It's there in the darker stones mixed into reconstructed buildings,
fire-blackened bricks from the original structures. It's there in the city's collective memory, preserved in museums, memorials, and the stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. Dresden 1946 reminds us that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, but World War I didn't truly end until the last generation who fought it died. Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, but for Japanese Americans imprisoned in internment camps, the war continued long after 1945. And for Dresden, the bombing of February 1945 was just the beginning of a longer agony, the year after the apocalypse, when survival was harder than death, when hope was more painful than despair, when peace looked remarkably like war. The Trümmerfrauen who cleared those ruins are mostly gone now. The children who played among the corpses are elderly. The stories are fading. But Dresden remains, rebuilt, restored, alive. A city that died and refused to stay dead. A city that was bombed into oblivion and reconstructed from its own ashes, not once, but twice, not easily, but inevitably. Because that's what humans do. We endure, we rebuild, we survive. Even when survival seems impossible. Especially then. This was Dresden, 1946. The year the war ended, but the suffering didn't. The year peace was harder than war. The year that history forgot. But we remember.